All right, so many people today believe something like this, and this may be a part of your worldview. Still, it may not be, but it goes something like this. I am the only one who can decide what is right and what is wrong for me. You know someone like that? Are you someone like that? We call this moral relativism. The individual person gets to define what is right and what is wrong. And I think the intellectually lazy part of this is to say, I'm only determining what's right and wrong for me. Whatever you want to do, you go and do. I'm just speaking about me. Morality and ethics and what defines a good life is relative from person to person in this scenario. But it doesn't satisfy in the long run. And I believe an ideology like that is self-destructive in the end. Because what happens when your morality, your moral code, what you're deciding to do for your life clashes with somebody else? Who gets to determine what is right and what is wrong in that situation? The one who's more powerful? The one who's more vocal? The one who's more dominating and domineering? Who gets to decide? If we're all moral relativists, like if you want to do this and you want to do this, that's okay. But when they clash, who wins out? Right? Which moral relativism is most powerful? But this belief is developed into a conclusion. And the conclusion is this. I am free to pursue any kind of life that I want for myself. And you know what this preaches in America? This is the American heartbeat. That you are free to pursue life, liberty, and happiness however you want to live. And it is destructive to the gospel. And it's destructive to being a Christian. That's a dilemma for Christians living in America. Today we're going to see that this idea of individual fulfillment, it's not a new idea. It's not a modern idea. It's not like we have evolved, we've become more sophisticated. We have this really cool idea today. It is honestly one of the oldest ways that you and I rebel against God. And embracing this idea as a way of living, that you're in charge, you can do whatever you want to do, you're going to fulfill yourself however you want to fulfill yourself, and that's okay. It is going to leave you broken, and it's going to leave you feeling utterly dissatisfied. There is a better way, as we sang about moments ago, and the gospel is what provides you with an infinitely greater way to live your life. And that's what the first part of this parable is about. Let's get to our proposition. We're going to see today, through the younger son, that God's grace restores broken sinners. Broken sinners who waste their life looking for fulfillment in all the wrong places. Hopefully you've been able to see that over the last few weeks, we have seen two kinds of people in our text. And this is intentional. I've put together these texts in this sequence on purpose. There are those who flaunt a society or a culture's morals or ethics or standards or rules or religion to make themselves feel better, to satisfy themselves. And then there are those on the right, I said intentionally, on the right, who will use morality and ethics and religion to make themselves feel better. We got the rule breakers and the rule keepers. It is essential for you, either if you're still processing the claims of Jesus, you're not there yet following Jesus, or you are a Christian. It is essential for both kinds of people to process and recognize, what kind of person am I naturally? Do I follow those rules to feel good? Or do I flaunt those rules to feel good? I do what I want to do. And what you need to see is that both kinds of people are rebels against our Creator and Jesus as Father. And both kinds of people are lost. So I want you to consider that the brothers in this parable, the younger brother who left and the older brother who stayed, which we'll get to next week, they are both lost and they are both broken. Both brothers, just from different points of view, different experiences, and different positions, they are rebels against their father. One uses self-fulfillment and worldly satisfaction, but the other one uses religion and duty and obedience to make himself feel good. And both have wasted their lives. seeking fulfillment in all the wrong places. And both need the same thing, which is a genuine experience of God's grace in their own set of circumstances. We see the younger son experience that today, but we are left at the end of the parable never knowing if the older son experiences it. And we'll talk about that next week and at Gathers to come. Let's go ahead and set the context. It comes from actually the very first and second verse of the chapter. This lets you know what the purpose of the parable is and who the intended audience of the parable is. And this should redefine if you've heard this before, your current understanding of the meaning of this parable. In verses 1 and 2, the same chapter, Luke tells us that all the tax collectors and all the sinners were coming to Jesus. They were listening to him. Now look at verse 2. And the Pharisees and the scribes, they were grumbling about it. And here's what they said. They said, this man Jesus receives sinners, and he eats with them. The religious right, the conservative religious leaders are grumbling about Jesus because he spends time with sinners. He spends time with the younger brother. This is what motivates Jesus to tell 3 parables back to back to back. Lost sheep, lost coin, lost boys. And this parable helps us answer an essential question. And I think it goes something like this. Can you fundamentally change who you are deep down to your core? I believe America and its value of independence, the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness, you want to naturally say yes. You can change who you are fundamentally. You can change your identity whenever you want. It is fluid. That's the ethic of today. Yes, a person can gain weight. I do it every holiday season and lose weight. I start mowing the lawn outside in the summertime. Yes, you can change your job. You can change your career. You can move from one part of the state to another. You can move across the country today. You can move across the world if you wanted to today. You can change what you wear, how you eat, what you watch, what you listen to, and what you spend your time doing, what you spend your money on. All that can change today. But that doesn't answer the question. Radically, deep down to your core, can you change anything about yourself? Morality, ethics, philosophy, and I think the Americana answers yes. Yes, you can. And that is why I believe conservative, religious right, Jewish leaders get so angry at sinners. But Christianity and the gospel says no. You can't. There's no morality, there's no ethics, no ethical system, no philosophy, no religion, no way of life that can actually change who you are where it matters, deep down into you. We are, in curvature say, curved in towards ourself. And there's no philosophy or religion or self-effort that can bend you back together again to where you could be fully restored in how you were intended to be. It is only an act of God's grace and compassion by what you experience, the joy and the sorrows, that you can change radically deep down to who you are. And that's what this parable is about today. So let's unpack it together. Let's get to our first point. We're going to have 2 points and an application, okay? Probably the same thing next week. You're like, man, Pastor, you're getting us 3 points the past couple Sundays. It's okay. The text drives the meaning and the points, all right? Sometimes it's shorter, sometimes it's longer. But here's the point. The pursuit of individual fulfillment, it's the reality. It fails. It utterly fails to satisfy your soul. Because we have a creator, we need to know what he says about what satisfies our lives best. Because you can go into marriage, and after a year or 10 years or 25 years, you figure out, this doesn't hit deep down. It doesn't. There is an old Presbyterian confession of faith called the Westminster Shorter Catechism. These London Christians, they put out some great theology like 400 years ago. The Shorter Catechism is a series of questions and answers. It's very short. It was designed for kids, little kids. This would be taught next door right now. That's how incredible. Short questions, short answers to introduce them to the basics of the faith. The very first question opens up, out of all questions to start with, it says, what is the chief end of man? Now, you can't get more relevant than that, right? Why do we exist? There's nothing more existential than answering this question. Why do you exist? What is your chief end? And that Presbyterian confession answers, and it says, your chief end is to glorify God, but listen to the next part, and enjoy him forever. So you can't kind of let that skate by. That means your chief end in life, the reason why your heart is beating and your brain is sending impulses, is that you were created for enjoyment. And many of you are like, yes, right? You were created to enjoy things. Now, you may think that based on this, that you're created for enjoyment, that the pursuit of individual fulfillment, like whatever you want to do to feel good, that's an okay way to live. You are the only one who decides what's right and what is wrong for you and what's going to feel good for you. You are free to pursue whatever it is you want. It doesn't matter what other people say. You do what you want to do. But that is not what the confession is saying. Deep enjoyment cannot and will not be found in individual fulfillment your way alone. It doesn't work like that. And there's a classic illustration that Lewis gives to help you understand. I've used this before. Where are fish happiest? Think about it for a moment. You realize fish are most successful, most satisfied, are able to live within their intended design in the most utterly restrictive environment. You get that? There's only one place, and one place alone, that they can thrive. The environment that they were created for. A fish cannot say to the Creator, you know what? I reject that idea. You have taken away my personal liberties and freedoms. I want to jump up on dry land today. I want to be where the people are, right? What will happen to that fish? Flop, die, and become Sunday night's fish fry, right? Why do you think God has created life like this? True enjoyment isn't found by doing whatever you want, whenever you want, and no one can tell you otherwise. No one can give you accountability or exhortation. That's not what human life is about. True enjoyment is found doing life God's way, within the parameters and the environment that He has given to you for enjoyment. This is what those who flaunt religion, who want to do things their way, like the adulterous woman from a couple weeks ago, and like this younger son, they just don't get. And maybe you may be here today and don't get this either. That actually your environment of greatest restriction is the environment of your greatest happiness. So we meet a father who has two sons. And this younger son asks for his inheritance early. Now, a modern reader like you and I, we probably glance over this because we're like, what's the problem with that? You and I are in 21st century American culture and not in first century traditional Middle Eastern culture. That is not how traditional Middle Eastern societies function. Sons get inheritance after father's death. And traditionally, the older son gets the lion's share of it all. This son is essentially saying to his dad, Dad, I wish you were dead so I can get what's coming to me. That is what's implied in a demand like this. He wants his father's things, but he doesn't want the father. Now, the younger son, which I'm just going to call younger for the rest of our time today and next week, thinks that the key to life is doing what younger wants and when younger wants it, and no older brother or father can tell him otherwise. Younger doesn't want his father to tell him what is right and what is wrong. Younger wants to do what younger wants to do. And that sounds like many of us, right? But there's a problem. Younger is dependent upon father's wealth in order to get whatever it is that he thinks is meaningful. He relies on his father's wealth and at the same time resents his father's authority. Despite this, dad divides his wealth up, which means older son gets less when papa dies. And it also means the father's estate has now diminished and they have to continue on. But right here, as he divides the wealth, we already see the father showing grace instead of condemnation. Because, right, older fathers, if your son basically said, I want you dead, give me some money, right, you're probably going to take the backhand out, right? But he does not. But days later, Younger abandons his family. He abandons his post. He abandons his country. He is finally free, and he thinks he has the means to finally pursue the life that he has wanted for himself this whole time. And let's take a look what happens in verse 13. Jesus says that not many days later, the younger son gathered everything together, went on a journey into a distant country, and there, this is the key phrase, Younger squandered his estates with loose living. Younger leaves his family, his country, for another country. And Jesus tells the scribes and Pharisees that Younger squandered his portion of the father's estate. And he squandered it on loose living, which we'll talk about at another time. This would have resulted in anger in these traditional, conservative, religious right people. You don't push back against traditional family values. You don't wish that your dad is dead. You don't just leave your family, go to another country, and waste everything the father did. They would be angry right now. And probably many of you get angry at a son or a person like this. In verse 14, we see that right when Younger wastes all of his inheritance, that a famine comes. Not before, when he had the means to take care of himself, but after he's wasted it, boom, famine strikes. And that's how God always works. And I think it's right here in the beginning of famine that we can see the work of God begin. Though we do not have the time for it, I can walk you through the scriptures. Give me an extra 10 minutes, and I can walk you through the scriptures to show you that in the final and the ultimate sense, God is behind all famine. And I think to be a Christian, you have to reconcile yourself to that biblical truth. In fact, God, his sovereign and fatherly hand, is behind all things, not just joy and prosperity, but also pain and adversity. Both, not just his sovereign hand, but also his fatherly hand is behind it all. God allows a famine to hit this country in part to help Younger to see that the pursuit of individual fulfillment, it doesn't work out in the long run. It may be fun today, and maybe tomorrow, and maybe several months from now, but eventually the money will wear out, and it will reveal really what's going on inside of you. So in verses 15 and 16, Younger seeks employment in a way that would have made the Pharisees even more angry. He's already pushed back against traditional family values, like so many people on the left do. How dare they? But then even more, famine hits, poverty strikes, and he goes and seeks employment. And at first you'd say, that's what you should do, right? What's wrong with people like this? They are lazy. They don't work. They don't earn a living. That's what many of you think. It's more complex than that, which shows you're being simple-minded. But this man goes to a pig farmer for employment, hires himself out. He is a slave to a pig farmer. And that would have made the scribes and the Pharisees even more livid. Because not only now is he pushing against traditional family values, he's pushing against Mosaic law itself. Because chief among unclean animals out there are those creatures that have split hooves, right? It's those pigs, it's the swine. Now this Jewish young man works with the pigs. And even worse, Younger is so poor and he is so hungry that he longs for the food that is his job to feed to the swine. It's crazy, right? What is Jesus doing here? Jesus is trying to show you the final analysis, the end run of a life that's dedicated to individual fulfillment. It doesn't work. Younger wanted to be free of his father and do whatever he wanted. And his father let him go, and gave him the means. Younger believed he was the only one that could decide what is right and what is wrong for his situation. And Younger experienced a season of enjoyment, but it was brief. He wasted his father's wealth on short-term satisfaction. The pursuit of individual fulfillment, doing life your way, it fails to address what is really going on deep down inside of you and what is your deepest need. That you were created, and life is best expressed and experienced when you glorify God by enjoying Him forever. Let's move to our second point now. All right, two more. In our second point, we're going to see now a focus on the Father, and that it's only the experience of God's grace that can find the lost and can resurrect the dead. It's got to be God's grace and God's grace first. Younger is poor, hungry, and doing a job that would disgrace his family and his country. And it is right there when Younger is at his lowest that we see God elevates his work of grace. And by it we see it is only the experience of God's grace that can resurrect the dead. Let's look at verse 17. In verse 17, Jesus says that when Younger had come to his senses, that's our key phrase right now. He said, "How many of my father's hired hands have more than enough bread, but I am dying here with hunger?" So I want us to focus on the phrase, "but when he came to his senses." How does a person come to their senses to see that they have wasted their lives? What's the mechanism by which a person can have this experience? And the gospel says, you can't make it happen. I can't make it happen. It has to be a work of God's grace. But let's go a little bit deeper with this. The person in question must experience it firsthand for themselves, the futility and the emptiness of how they've decided to live. Younger wasn't going to learn this by going to synagogue and sitting underneath the rabbis. He's never going to learn that individual fulfillment doesn't work out just by going to school. Education has a purpose, and it's a mighty purpose, but it cannot teach this. He wasn't going to learn by his dad drilling it into him, or older brother with his seething condemnations pooling out to him. Younger could only learn it firsthand by what he experienced. So we learn that low circumstances and coming to one's senses is God's work. It's a part of God's grace to find the lost and to resurrect the dead. Only God's grace can make a person come to their senses, because you and I are way too curved into ourselves. We will only keep the downward spiral going and going and going until God says, stop. So Younger, right now, this low point, he compares his life to that of his father's slaves in hired hands. They get to eat so much bread, and he has nothing. He wants those swine pods. He develops a plan, and I want you to take a look at it in verse 18 and verse 19. Here's his plan. He says, I'm going to get up, I'm going to go to my dad. I'm going to say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son, so make me as one of your hired men. In verse 12, Younger wanted to be free of his father's reach. Younger wanted to do what Younger wanted to do. But God's grace is at work. And it works through the wasting of his life, the wasting of his inheritance, the futility of experiencing satisfaction his way. He's like the fish who wants to jump out of water because he thinks it's going to be better for him. And he works through suffering, he works through famine, he works through poverty, and he works through hunger. Younger is now going to return to his father, and he's going to confess. He's going to confess that he sinned against heaven, which is against God, and he sinned against his own father. He's going to confess that he is no longer worthy. He's no longer worthy to be called a son. He already had his inheritance. The relationship is done, or so he thinks. Younger's solution is that he can survive famine and poverty and feeling so desperately hungry if his father would treat him like a hired hand. Let's see how it goes. Verse 20, he leaves a distant country, he goes home. He goes to his father. But look at what it says. While Younger was still a long way off, the father saw him and felt compassion for him. And this old man runs to his son, embraces him, and kisses him. I hope you've been able to see a thread that has been running through our texts the last several weeks. It's been on purpose. People are distressed and dispirited. People are beset by sin, the adulterous woman. People are broken, bloodied, left for dead on the side of the road. People are dead set on their ways, pursuing what they want at all costs, no matter what you say to them. But then there's Jesus, who steps in and confronts the Pharisees and the scribes and the adulterous woman. There's the Samaritan, which is Jesus himself, taking the broken, the bloodied, left on the side of the road for dead and bringing him back to life. And then there's the Father. And they're all experiencing and acting out of compassion. The Father sees his son far off, and he runs to him. Now, once again, as modern 21st century Americans, we don't see any significance in this, because we are not living in a first century traditional Middle Eastern society. Dignified, rich, affluent heads of households in first century Middle East do not run. Children run. The ladies run in this culture. But dignified rich men don't run. This is actually the greatest example of being a prodigal right here. Not the younger son, but the father. Father embraces Younger and kisses him. Father makes the first move. And notice here, unlike the scribes and Pharisees, unlike those who are religious, unlike the older son, his first response isn't, so you got it out of you? You ready to get back to work? Right? Like that's going to fix things. His first response isn't condemnation, and it isn't judgment. It's compassion. Do you see that? Compassion, embrace, and kissing. In verse 21, Younger tries to talk Dad through his prepared speech. Younger confesses his sin, he confesses his unworthiness, but he could not get out his plan to be employed as a hired hand or a slave because the father interrupts. And thank God for that. Let's take a look at his interruption in verses 22 and 23. Father says, quickly, bring out the best robe, put it on him, put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. So I can't imagine how he looked. Then he says, bring the fattened calf, kill it, let us eat, and let us celebrate. The reality is, Younger has already had his inheritance. The relationship technically is severed. Legally, there is nothing else that the father needs to do. Instead, the father clothes the son with robe, ring, and sandals. Now, once again, in an affluent, traditional, first century Middle Eastern family, what person do you think has the best robe? Let's make it gather for a moment. What's the answer? Who has the best robe in a family like this? The father. He's the patriarch, right? The father gave up his best robe for his son's best. Now think of the effect. Younger comes home wrapped in father's robe. What would the effects be? Right? This is about identification. Father's robe, father's ring, father's sandals. The father's grace is identifying younger as a son, not a slave. The father is saying, yes, you have sinned. Yes, you are unworthy. But no matter what you have said and no matter what you have done, you are my son. Younger looked for fulfillment his way, his timing, what he wanted, and it left him empty, destitute, and hungry. But grace and compassion in and through the Father brings new value and new meaning to younger. The Father directs his slaves to slay the fattened calf for a feast and a celebration. Younger, moments ago, was so hungry, he would eat pig's food. And probably a couple hours later, he would be feasting on beef tenderloin. You know that? Why did the Father do this? And why does the Father celebrate? It's because grace alone, or what the Reformers called sola gratia, can find the lost and resurrect the dead. Let's take a look at verse 24 so we can hear Dad say it. He says to his hired hands, he says, this son of mine was dead, and he's come to life again. He was lost, and now he's been found. And then they began to celebrate. The greatest tragedy in life isn't getting what you want. It isn't doing what you feel, doing whatever you want when you want it. The greatest tragedy in life is to be physically alive and spiritually dead. Younger thought that by leaving, he would find himself, that he would truly be alive. But we know now he's just a fish out of water. That's all that he did. In reality, leaving confirmed that he was lost and dead. But grace alone can bring a person home to the Father. Grace alone can find the lost and resurrect the dead, and that is a cause for celebration. Grace enables a rebel to see the futility of their rebellion. Grace enables a person, enables a rebel to come home and enjoy who they are as family, and that it is greater than the pursuit of fulfillment and satisfaction their way. That is Younger's legacy to us. So now let's go to application. So what does this mean for us? How do we take Younger and how do we take the Father, put them together, and what does this mean for our lives? I think this is it. You and I today, it may be different for each and every one of us, but the theme is still the same. You and I are to reject the pursuit of individual fulfillment, meaning life your way. You shirk family, you shirk church family, you shirk Christianity for what you want to do when you want to do it. And the call today is to reject the pursuit of individual fulfillment above all. And here's how we do it. It's by enjoying the lavishness of God's grace. That's how we do it. Let's talk about it. I believe that the celebration that the Father held for Younger is better and sweeter and more satisfying than any experience that Younger had while he was wasting his inheritance. The question is to you. I think that celebration was better. The parable isn't over, Branchton. I believe we've only read the exposition and the complication. And I think American Christianity stops right here because it fuels their evangelistic efforts. But this is just complication. The story is not done yet. We'll get to it next week. You need to see, though, that Younger's story, in essence, is the story of every Christian. It may not be on loose living, but you have a deep down desire to do what you want when you want to do it, and you will shirk anything. Traditional values, family values, church values, whatever it is, because you want to do what you want to do. It's very human. And Younger teaches us that we must reject this temptation to set individual fulfillment above all things. God is our creator. Yet you, like Younger and I, we have this natural desire to resist and to resent God for this. You want the Father's things too, but you don't want the Father himself. And you don't want the responsibility of being a son and daughter of God. And the reality is God is going to let you, just like the dad in this parable. You're going to get what you want, but it will not leave you or keep you satisfied. The pursuit of individual fulfillment fails to satisfy the soul. And next week we'll see, jumping to the other extreme and being the older brother, it's not going to satisfy the soul either. He's critical, he's angry, he's judgmental, he's not satisfied, just as much as the younger brother isn't. Then we'll see what the solution is. And it's not being a moderate, it's not shirking liberalism or conservatism for moderism. There's something else, and we'll get to it. God's grace in the gospel frees you from all of this by seeing that the greater enjoyment in life is God. You fight the temptation to live for yourself, individual fulfillment, by experiencing greater enjoyments. I feel like this has been a weekend of C.S. Lewis for me, but that's okay. I didn't plan it this way, it just happened. C.S. Lewis, you know, one of my favorite writers, one of my favorite Christians, Oxford literature professor. He had the opportunity once. He wasn't a pastor. He wasn't a theologian. He was just a college professor who was a Christian. And he used what God gave him. He had the opportunity to preach one sermon in his whole life. It's called The Weight of Glory. You can find it online. You can purchase it. I want to share a little snippet. Now, this quote right here, I probably use in one way or another one time a year here in Branchton over the last 10 years. You probably should have heard this before if you've been around for a while. Here's what he said. Dr. Lewis says that if we consider the unblushing promises of reward, the staggering nature of the rewards that are promised in the gospel, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us. We're like that ignorant child who wants us to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased. It's pretty good just for a college professor right there. That preaches. Let's talk about this now. Younger's problem, and I think our fundamental problem, is that we think our desires are too strong for God, right? God can't satisfy me. That's why I need this substance in me at all times. My desires are too strong. I need something too bad. That's what we think, and that's our rationale and our excuse to live life like Younger. Younger needed to pursue his desires away from his family. You too may think that your desires are too strong for God. God cannot satisfy you. So you have to take matters into your own hands. Do what you want to do on a Saturday versus what being a family contributing person should do in their family, right? Brothers and sisters, sons and daughters of God. You too may think you need to pursue your desires away from God. But the reality is you're wrong. And like Younger, you too need to come to your senses. Your desires, don't think there's like something special about you. Your desires are not too strong. You're too weak. Your desires are too weak. It's not strong enough. That is why Younger fooled about with loose living and resented being his father's son. And that is why you fool about with what you do versus the unblushing promises and the staggering nature of the promises in the gospel because you don't believe it. You don't believe that God's life, God's way, His truth, His life is going to make you feel better than what you did last night. You're the fish out of water. And Lewis says, you're far too easily pleased. And you're actually being a half-hearted creature. You think you're being full-hearted, and that's why you're doing what you're doing, but you're actually being half-hearted. Christianity begins when you acknowledge, I'm that ignorant child. I honestly think that me making my mud pies is infinitely better than the invitation to enjoy a holiday by the sea. Christianity begins when you confess, the desires that I have are not too strong, they're actually too weak. I am far too easily pleased. But the question is, how do you reject the futility of pursuing individual fulfillment? Thinking that, I know we think it's crazy, but this is how we work. It's how younger is, it's how we are, it's how this child is. How do we push past it? Making mud pies in the slum is not a better experience than going to a free holiday by the sea. What's the mechanism by which this changes in us? You must experience it for yourself firsthand. You can't be shown. You can't be taught. Education can only go so far. You need to experience for yourself and then be able to confess, I am that half-hearted creature. My desires are actually way too weak, and I've wasted on these little experiences and little desires that were never going to do anything for my soul. You need to experience wasting your life so you can see how much better life is loving and following Jesus. Our Father does this through the death and resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. Like younger, on your own, you are lost and you are dead. So am I, on my own, independence of God. God has grace through Jesus to bring the lost home and to resurrect the dead. We are only brought back to life through the death of Jesus. Because Jesus, which we will get to at the end next time, he is actually the true elder brother that we need. The older brother in this parable is terrible, and it should leave you longing for a better brother. And that better brother is our Lord Jesus. But for now, I want to bring us back to the beginning. In the beginning of our service today, we read a set of verses from Hebrews chapter 12. And I want to revisit this right now. Because our elder brother, our Lord Jesus himself, gave us the key of understanding we're half-hearted creatures, we're actually far too easily pleased, and how it is that we are to push past those things. This is the answer. I'm going to read it one more time. The writer says, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. And this is where it's coming in. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. Look at what Jesus did. Jesus, who for the joy set before him, that's the critical phrase. That is how he was able to endure the cross, despise shame, and he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Then the writer tells you, consider him who endured such hostility by sinners against himself so that you won't grow weary, so that you won't lose heart. So let's ask some questions of the text. How do we not grow weary and lose heart in this life? How do we not grow resentment towards the Father? How does anyone lay aside their encumbrances and entanglements because we are far too easily pleased, and therefore we get addicted to things that we should never be addicted to? What's the answer? We consider Jesus. We fix our eyes on him. We look at the way that Jesus encountered and responded to adversity and suffering. How did Jesus do it? He set greater joy in front of him. That's what he did. And as a church member, you should know that this is what affirmation number 7 is all about. Affirmation number 7 here as a church family is that I will fight sin. I will fight adversity by embracing my church family's vision for joy in Jesus. Our vision for joy in Jesus is this. We fix our eyes. We take our eyes off of whatever we think is going to satisfy. We put it on Jesus. And we consider how Jesus pushed through those things. And he pushed it by putting greater joy in front of his eyeballs and on his tongue and in his heart and in his belly. He put joy in front of him. You can only push through temptation to pursue life the way that you want when you too focus on greater enjoyment. Here we go. I can say no to the temptation of drive-thru burger today because I know I am having filet tonight. I'm not having filet tonight in reality, but I've said this to you over the years because it connects with affirmation number 7 and it's something very critical to being a Christian because our desires aren't too strong. Do you realize your desire to go to your drive-thru burger, whatever it is, doesn't mean your desires for life are too strong. It just means it's too weak because filet is better than drive-thru burger. The joy that Jesus fixated on is infinitely better than the joy that you're fixating on. And God will let you go and to the point famine brings you so low that you want the swine food. You want the drive-thru burger. But this is our strategy for joy. We fight for joy by putting the offer, the holiday by the sea, in front of our eyes and considering it greater than whatever we want to do because it's just making mud pies in the slum. It's just hitting that drive-thru joint on the way home today or whatever it is that you want to do. God's grace is the greater enjoyment. It restores the broken sinner like you and like me who have wasted life by looking for fulfillment our way. And that's the preaching of God's word this morning and just the beginning of the parable. And we'll talk this Wednesday and then next Sunday about its continuation.